Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being here. I do have to say that the Chao Collective's presentation by Charles was amazing and covered some of similar points that I'm going to raise in my presentation. But what's good is I think they'll be complementary to each other. And hopefully I won't be too repetitive. I want to emphasize the US military strategy to try to contain China in scare quotes. What we're talking about is not just containment. We're actually talking about rollback. And this is a misunderstanding that goes back to the history of the first Cold War. The narrative taught in US schools is that Washington's strategy was containment, to contain communism and socialism. In fact, if you go back to NSC 68, the National Security Council memo that was published in 1950, it actually shows the US strategy was not containment, it was rollback, that is to say regime change. Containment is the nicer sounding policy. The US says we need to contain communism. The reality, as we all know, is that the US government, using the CIA, using the Pentagon, using economic means, was waging war on socialism around the world. And that didn't mean containing it. It meant overthrowing socialism anywhere that it could. And today we see a similar policy aimed toward the People's Republic of China. It's not simply one of containment, trying to contain China economically, politically, and militarily. It also is threatening China militarily, economically, and politically. Today, I'm going to focus a bit about the military threats that the United States has been waging against China. To understand this, we should go back to the 2018 National Defense Strategy that was published by the Pentagon. This was the first national defense strategy published in a decade, and it made it very clear that the so-called war on terror, that era was over, and the new era is the new Cold War, the second Cold War. This national defense strategy, published then by James Mattis, who was the defense secretary, said very clearly that the top so-called threats to US national security are China and Russia. In the first tier, below them were Iran, the DPRK, Venezuela, and below them, in the third tier, is so-called non-state terrorism, going back to this rhetoric of the war on terror. We've seen other statements and documents released since then that confirm further that the US military and NATO see China and Russia as their main so-called threats. For instance, after the Madrid summit held this June by NATO, the US-led imperialist military alliance, there was the adoption of the first defense strategy in a decade for NATO, which they called the 2022 strategic concept. It's very similar to the Pentagon's national defense strategy. In fact, they even use some of the same language. It's very clear the Pentagon played a leading role in authoring the NATO defense strategy, the so-called strategic concept, which is the first one adopted since 2010 in 12 years. This 2022 strategic concept declares that Russia is the top threat, referring to Russia as a threat to NATO. And then it refers to China as a strategic competitor and an authoritarian regime, and says that China threatens the so-called rules-based order, of course, in which Washington makes the rules and orders everyone around, and makes it clear that NATO considers Russia and China, given their strategic partnership, to be a bloc, and that NATO considers them to be the main so-called threat to the US-led military alliance. So I wanted to provide that background context in order to understand a few plans that have been leaked from the Pentagon that I think are very instructive to understand the US empire strategy to, again, not only to contain China, but to roll back, that is to try to overthrow the Chinese government and to use offensive military means in order to achieve that. In order to discuss this today, I want to go to an article that was published by Nikkei, which is a major Japanese business-oriented media outlet. And Nikkei published an article in 2021 that disclosed plans that the Pentagon made to spend $27.4 billion over the next 6 years. So this was in 2021. So this would be between 2021 and 2027, in order to put intermediate range ballistic missile systems aimed toward China on the first island chain. And the Chao Collective and Charles did a great presentation looking at the geopolitics of this, the geography. I just want to briefly get up this map here, just because I think, once again, it's important to take a look at how this would work. This is the map that was released by Nikkei of the first island chain and its announcement that the Pentagon is planning $27.4 billion in investment in order to surround China. Now, there's a few other details that I want to point out here. These are not defensive missile systems. If we look, for instance, at the THAAD anti-missile system in South Korea, which is extremely unpopular, the argument that the United States uses to justify putting these systems in, especially in communities in South Korea that don't want the systems, that threaten these communities, the argument is that these are defensive anti-missile systems. That's in South Korea. That is completely different from what we're talking about here. We're talking about offensive missile systems that the Pentagon plans to put on the first island chain aimed at China. And I'm just going to read a few quotes here from this study, this article published by Nikkei. It found that the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is the military branch overseeing this, published a report that outlines its strategy for a so-called Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And Nikkei pointed out that in this 6-year investment plan submitted to Congress, the U.S. military's Indo-Pacific Command made it clear that ground-based weapons will be crucial in breaking through China's defense systems. So I need to stress that again. This is explicitly offensive. It is about breaking through China's defensive systems. The article pointed out that it cited the U.S. military proposal. So this is from the language of the Pentagon. It said, quote, "Without a valid and convincing conventional deterrent, China is emboldened to take action in the region and globally to supplant U.S. interests." Note that they don't even make the pretense, the Pentagon doesn't make the pretense in this report that China is threatening U.S. national security. Instead, they say that China is supplanting U.S. interests, which means U.S. hegemony, of course. The report in Nikkei also emphasized that this proposal was supported, that it was passed, approved, that is, by the U.S. Congress. So this is happening. There hasn't been a lot of reporting on this, but again, we're talking about $27.4 billion. And this leads me to another part of my presentation here. So these are the plans that the Pentagon has. Now, I should point out that there is kind of one small issue here. The U.S. has actually been unable to pressure its so-called allies to agree to installing these intermediate range ballistic missile systems. Now, another key element of this is we need to understand how this is also related to the U.S. new Cold War on Russia, and how the Donald Trump administration in 2019 unilaterally withdrew from the INF, that is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, there was a little reporting on this at the time in 2019, and some Democrats, for the first time, were willing to criticize these very aggressive hawkish policies toward Russia, only because Donald Trump was president. Now, the Biden administration, of course, has not renegotiated the INF treaty. So what does that mean? That means that Washington can now deploy ground-based missile systems, including intermediate-range ballistic missiles, with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So the only reason that the U.S. can now do this in the first island chain is precisely because the Donald Trump administration tore up that INF treaty. And of course, it was John Bolton, his neoconservative national security advisor, who was one of the main forces behind that. And the way that was presented at the time is something that could potentially lead to a hot war with Russia. We now see with the proxy war between NATO and Russia and Ukraine, it's a very dangerous situation. But also, Trump leaving unilaterally the INF treaty had serious consequences for the U.S. strategy toward China, which is precisely what allows this offensive strategy toward China. And concluding here, I want to look at a study that was published by the RAND Corporation. And there has been recently, there was a fake RAND Corporation study that was leaked about alleged U.S. plans to destroy Germany's economy. Now, I don't doubt that the U.S. it does have plans to destroy Germany's economy, but that actually was not a real RAND Corporation report. I want to emphasize this is a real RAND Corporation report that is on the RAND Corporation website. It's easy to find. It was published this year, 2022, and it's titled Ground-Based Intermediate Range Missiles in the Indo-Pacific, Assessing the Position of U.S. Allies. So while I was talking about the Pentagon's plans that were approved by Congress to spend $27.4 billion to surround China with an offensive intermediate range ballistic missile system, we should point out that the US allies in the region actually are not fully comfortable with the strategy, largely because they understand that if they were to host these missiles, that would make them targets of China's systems if a war were to break out between the United States and China, potentially over Taiwan. We see, of course, the United States repeatedly threatening China over Taiwan, which of course is part of China. And Biden, in his speech at the United Nations, he claimed to still support the one China policy. Of course, we know that's very hypocritical language. It's part of this US concept of strategic ambiguity, where you say one thing and do another. But the point is that Biden has repeatedly threatened China, saying that the US would militarily intervene in a conflict over Taiwan in order to support separatist forces in Taiwan. What that means is it could lead to a broader regional war in the Pacific. And we now see that other countries in the region are very wary of this, because they understand that means they could be bombed by China. So briefly here, I want to just look at a few quotes from this RAND Corporation study, which looked at the 5 treaty allies of the United States in the Pacific region, which include Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. The RAND Corporation study lamentably concluded that, quote, finding an ally willing to host GBIRMs, that stands for ground-based intermediate range missiles, is more challenging than finding allies willing to host other types of US military forces, such as air bases. They say, quote, there are several reasons why US allies could deny access to and use of their territories, including fears that hosting such systems could intensify a regional arms race with China and risk the deployment of being seen as provocative, sparking harsh reactions from Beijing, as well as fears of entrapment in a conflict between the United States and China that does not directly involve the ally. So given the reality of these limitations, that Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand are not really gung-ho about installing these offensive US missile systems aimed directly at China, the RAND Corporation, of course, the RAND Corporation is a US military contractor, and this report was compiled on behalf of the US Air Force, on behalf of the US military. So given this reality, the RAND Corporation made several suggestions for the US military at the end of the report. And they say that other potential options could be deploying ground-based intermediate range missile systems instead on Guam, of course, which is a US colony in the Pacific. And they also concluded the most realistic strategy would be for Washington to strengthen its military alliance with Japan and South Korea. But if Japan and South Korea are not willing to host these intermediate range systems, then they could potentially do it by expanding the US military foothold in the region. And they argued that the reason that might be more appealing to US allies is that if there's this war that breaks out, China would potentially bomb the US military bases in Japan, in South Korea, and not Japanese and South Korean infrastructure that is hosting these US offensive missile systems. So I just wanted to point out those 2 reports, one from the Japanese business paper Nikkei, and also from the RAND Corporation. Those are 2, of course, very mainstream sources closely linked to the US government. And they spell out very clearly that the US military is making plans for war with China, and it is not in any way for a defensive war. Obviously, the US is on the other side of the planet. The US cannot wage a defensive war in the Pacific region. So we need to, I think, study what these institutions are saying to see what these plans are. And of course, you can bet that the Chinese military is doing that as we speak. So thanks for this opportunity. I think it's a very important panel, and it's a pleasure speaking here today.